Welcome to the studio and welcome to our Snowman Everyday Art Series tutorial. In this class, we are going to paint a really pretty snowman on a 6-inch round substrate. For this first class, we'll just focus on getting the background done. You can see a class that I've done in the past for this Let It Snow piece. So this snowman is going to grace our little 6-inch round as well. If you're interested in my full classes, send me a message or find me on Patreon. I'll have some links in the description for you. So let's get started. To get started for our background, we are going to mix a very light gray color. You can see on my palette that I've gotten started a little bit, but I'm going to show you exactly how to mix this color. We're going to start with our burnt sienna, phthalo blue, and titanium white. And particularly if you are using professional grade paints, it just takes just a tiny little bit. Um, I ordinarily paint with golden heavy body paints, so these will be a little bit of an adjustment for me, but they're very pigmented paints, so you just need the tiniest little bit. So if we take just the tiniest little bit of the phthalo blue, and you can see just dipping my paintbrush in that, how pigmented that is. If we add in some of the burnt sienna, then the burnt sienna grays that blue out. It's one of my favorite grays to make. And then add in the titanium white, and you get just this pretty gray color. Um, if you wanted a little bit more blue, you can certainly add in a little bit of blue, but it's it's so pigmented and it just takes the tiniest little bit. I'm going to add a little bit more of the titanium white down onto my styrofoam plate. I do think that the styrofoam plates are the way to go for these small paintings. When I finish painting today, I can just put another plate over the top after I lightly mist it with some water, slip it into a Ziploc bag, and it will save there for me and be ready for me um, to paint again. If you have too much paint in your brush from mixing that color, then just make sure that you pinch wipe out your brush. And I'm just going to let it vary a little bit. I love starting with the backgrounds because it's really a nice way to warm up and get a feel for how the paints feel. They feel a little bit different every day. I'm just going to paint right over this area where the little evergreen is on his hat. And I don't have to be too worried up here um, around his hat. If I go over that line, it's fine. We're going to be coming back in to paint the hat in. So every now and then I can just dip back into a little bit of more of the titanium white and just let your brush dance across the surface a little bit. This gives us some of those fun variations in the color. And I want to make sure that I get it light enough, particularly up around the snowman face. We don't often think about how important it is to warm up, even with art. But I do like to think of it as a warm up when I'm getting started. I notice that the very first few paint strokes that I make on any piece when I come to my studio, it just takes a little bit of time to really settle in again and get warmed up. You saw me there a second ago dip into the airbrush medium. I have it just in this little cap, the little condiment cup. I have a little lid that I can snap on it. I love using it that way. If you don't have a little cup, you can certainly just pour some out onto your paper plate and dip into it from there. Like I said before, I'm not being terribly careful around anything here because when I come back in to paint the cardinal, I can clean up all of those edges. I have a little rag beside me um, for my paintbrush. It's nice to be able to either pinch wipe out your brush if you need to control the amount of paint that you have in your brush. You can certainly use a paper towel. I try not to use a paper towel in my studio too much because I have two dogs that love to steal and eat my paper towels, and I try to keep that from happening. So as I'm painting this background, like I mentioned before, let some of those variations in color happen. You can sort of see it on the camera. If you feel like things are drying too quickly on your palette, just have a little mist bottle, give a little light mist to the surface of your plate, and that will help to keep things a little bit wetter for you as you're painting. On this edge, I'm really just going to press my paintbrush in around that edge to get into some of those grooves in the wood substrate. When you get your engraved panel, if you want to, you can certainly grab a little bit of sandpaper and sand those edges. I haven't sanded this one, so it's certainly not something you have to do, but you could. And I didn't mention it at the beginning of the class, but before you start to paint, it really is nice to apply a coat of the GAC 100. And again, that's going to be, I'll leave a link in the description for you so that you can get some of that. It's a wonderful barrier between the wood and your paint. And you can see there that I'm kind of going over some of those areas again. Acrylics need a couple of coats sometimes, and it dries really quickly, which is kind of a blessing and a curse all at once. But don't worry about it drying. We can still come back in and add more coats. I am going to fast forward here while I finish this background. Before I do that, I want to mention that along the edges, I'm going to allow that to be a little bit of a darker gray back here. So I'm just going to mix up a little bit more of the phthalo blue and this burnt sienna to make a little bit of a darker color. And I'm going to use that color to go all the way around the outside edge. So that's what I will be painting there. I'm going to fast forward it from here, and when we come back, we'll see what we should do next. Okay, so take your time with that background. The the sides of these substrates can be quite thirsty, so don't hesitate to pick up a little bit of the airbrush medium in your brush and brush it along the edge. Um, as always, with acrylic paints, it might need another coat as it dries. We'll just keep an eye on it. The same with the base on the front. It could need another coat. Once it dries and everything starts to sort of settle in, acrylic paints can dry a little bit darker than what you see when you paint. So never be afraid to come back in and do another coat of paint on top. I did go ahead and pull over the GAC 100. Definitely before you start painting, don't forget to do a coat of this over the entire surface of your piece. So, just a thin coat of it. You can actually see some here on my palette. This is the GAC 100. So you just apply a thin coat. You can come back over it and apply another coat if you like. It dries clear, but it's just a nice barrier and it keeps your paint from soaking into the surface of your wood too much. I'm going to go ahead and put out a little bit more of the titanium white. I'm putting out just little bits of paint at a time because I don't want it to dry too quickly on my palette here. And I'm just going to come back in with a little bit more of the white just to make sure that I have a nice coverage on the whole background. And through this, I'm also going to just clean up the edge of the substrate just a little bit. Just filling in some of those little inconsistencies in the wood right there. And I hope that you could see, even as I painted the background, um, when I came back in and did some extra little coats of paint on the surface, I was really loose and really letting some of those color variations happen. So I'm going to leave my background there for now. You can take your time with yours. Like I said, don't be afraid to come back in and add another coat. If you want to take a break at this point and let it dry before you come back and continue on, that's perfectly fine. But I think that what I would like to do now is go ahead and start getting our snowman based in. And I'm going to start off by making him really darker than I know I want him to be. So I'm going to mix up just a little bit more of that same gray that we used on the background. So again, that was phthalo blue, and you can see I just did just a little dot of it. That's probably even too much. It's the paints are just so strong, and it's a lovely thing about them because you really get that high pigment. And if you're going to paint quite a bit, you'll probably find yourself wanting to get another larger bottle of the titanium white. You'll go through much more of the white and the yellow than anything else. So I'm just mixing a somewhat light gray color. And I'm going to start to base in the snowman. A lot of times when I'm painting, I'll start off with an area that I feel the most confident about. And yes, even after more than 40 years of painting, there are still there's still times that you don't feel overly confident about one thing or another. So I can start off in this bigger section of his body here. I'm just going to pick up some straight titanium white there to start to blend it in. I made an absolute mess as I was opening my new paints this morning. Um, the little seals that they have on them are really annoying. So don't do what I did. If you're opening brand new paints, don't open it over your piece. So that gives us just a base in. That's just the first look. Don't get too don't get too worried about it at this point. Every layer that we come back in and add over this first layer will get better and better as we go forward. So when you start to embrace those layers, um, it really is kind of comforting, I guess is the right word, to know that it doesn't have to be absolutely right at this stage. Just using the very side of my filbert there, you can see just to get into the smaller areas. That's one of the things I love about the filberts is how you can use them so many different ways to fit into different areas. You can see that's quite dark there. That's okay. I'm going to want to be building some of his shape, so I'm purposefully letting that get a little bit darker. For this piece, I'm going to have my light source coming from the top right. So this bottom part of our snowman's arm will have a little bit more shadow. And as you're painting around these edges, don't be hard on yourself. If you get off the line and you get into the background, it's completely fine. We can come back in and just put a little bit more of the background color back in. So now I'm going to pick up a little bit of the lighter color for the top of his arm. And I know this is too dark, but I need that dark in first so that the lighter areas, when I come back in to add some of the highlights, some of the whiter snow, it has a nice background to go on top of. Just painting over the Cardinal's feet there. I'm going to add a little bit more of a shadow over here. So I just picked up a little bit of that darker color. Now I can wipe my brush off on my little towel over here and pick up some more of the titanium white and just go over those two colors. And I'm already out of titanium white on my palette again. Put out a little bit more of the titanium white. The side of my piece is still a little wet, so I'm trying not to put my fingers in it too much. So I added a little bit more of the titanium white, wiped out my brush a little bit, and just going back over that between those two layers. And if you haven't worked with acrylics before, um, You can get a little bit frustrated by how quickly they dry. Don't worry about how quickly it dries. We can still come back over the top of anything that we're painting and adjust it again. Needed a little bit more of that gray color. So you can see I can come back in with that dark color like I did there, and then pick up some of the light color to go right over that wet paint. Let's put a little bit more light up on top of his arm here. And try to think about the brush stroke direction that you're using. It is important as we're painting. It really helps to build that sense of form if we're sort of paying attention to what that brush stroke direction is. Sometimes I'll dip my brush into the airbrush medium and then wipe it out. It just kind of gets some of that extra paint out of my brush. Then I can dip back into the airbrush medium just with the little tips of the bristles, dab some of that out, and then run my brush along that line that kind of formed there, that harsh line. So that looks pretty good. I know that I know that if you're brand new to painting, you're looking at this and thinking, Shelly, he's a gray snowman. I need to let this layer dry. I'm going to be coming back in and building in some of those brighter whites, but I need this base to work with. Let's go ahead and get in his face using some of that same gray blue color. Pick up a little bit more of the titanium white there. And since the other gray is still in my brush, I still have some of that coming in. If the paint doesn't seem to be spreading the way that you would like, just dip into the airbrush medium. I like to use the airbrush medium rather than water. If you prefer to use water, that's perfectly fine too. I just find that the airbrush medium gives me a better result in the long run. Sometimes the water can kind of almost cut through the paint rather than help spread it. You can see that's a little bit of a different value, a little bit of a different tone of that color, but don't worry about don't worry about that at all. In fact, embrace that when the color changes a little bit. All of those variations are really going to add to the final piece. I don't know about you. If you've spent time painting, I can lose track of time. I love working with the paint. I love brush mixing. You'll notice as I paint that I very rarely wash my brush out. It's only when I'm switching between colors that I want to keep a little bit more pure. If I was painting with a yellow, I would probably um, more carefully wash out my brush. But the more times that you dip your brush into your water to rinse it, the more water you're introducing into your paints, and you can kind of end up fighting with that a little bit. So I don't really wash the brush in my water very often. I'm just going to tap in a little bit more white just because I get impatient. You can certainly let yours dry a little bit more before coming back in. But you can see even here as I come back in, even though that first layer that I did isn't dry, it's already starting to, show up that brighter white and give us a really pretty look to the snowman. A little bit too much light in my brush, so I'm just going to tap it out on my towel and come back in, just pick up a little bit of that darker color again. And then I'm going to just soften again a little bit. So dipped into the airbrush medium to get most of the paint out of my brush. Now I have mostly just a little bit of airbrush medium in my brush. I can come back over and just tap along some of those areas to settle it in. So that is a really good start for part one of our snowman. In the next part, we will do a little bit more refining on the snowman. We'll get a little bit more of his highlights and make him look a little bit more like the end result that we want him to be. Um, at this stage, what I will be doing is coming back in and making sure that I have a good coverage around all of my background. Just make sure that I have everything coated the way that I want it to be, that the wood isn't showing through in any areas. And then we will be ready for the next class. We will certainly finish the snowman in the next class, get his nose and mouth and eyes in, and maybe even get his scarf in. Maybe we'll do that for part two. So thanks so much for joining me. Part two is linked in the bottom, in the description of this video. So I'll meet you there. Welcome to the studio. In this video, we're going to start bringing our snowman to life. We're going to work on some of the elements, the hat and the scarf, maybe even some of the cardinal. Now, all of those elements will really help us start to be able to judge any further changes we want to make when we start adding some highlights to the snowman. So get comfortable, grab something warm to drink, and let's have fun painting. So I'm going to open up my palette. I just have my plate in a Ziploc. So I'll pull it out and we'll start to get ready to paint a little bit more. I'm going to grab, let's start with the number 6 filbert. And I think I'm going to start painting the hat. At the end of the first video, I mentioned that I thought for this part we would start on the snowman. And during my break of giving the dogs their lunch and thinking about it, I realized that it might be better to lay in some of these other details first so that we can get a good view of how everything is coming together. Color is so relational, and making too many changes too early to the snowman can mean we have to do more edits later. So always be willing to shift your ideas and do something a little bit differently. I'm going to start out with some black. I just put out a little bit of the carbon black on my palette, And I might actually go ahead, since we've got some phthalo blue still here, I might dip into that and let that mix in a little bit. It just livens up our black a little bit. And I'm just going to start to base this into our snowman. This littler brush really does give us a little bit more control, and we can just take our time and run it along that line to start to paint the hat in. Remember, if you make a mistake here and you get outside of the area that we are wanting the hat to be, don't panic. We can always come back in and adjust the background a little bit. It's one of those things that um, one of those places where having the limited palette really comes in handy. We know we can mix that color again because there's so few colors. Everything is going to come together in the end because of our limited palette. And um, mixing the exact right color was always something when I first started out painting that I really stressed about. The reality is that if the color is a little bit different, that's kind of good. It's good to have those variations. Turn my round over a little bit. It's a little bit easier for me to paint up to a line rather than paint down to a line, if that makes sense. I don't have to worry too much at the center band because we're going to come in with paint there. You'll sometimes have a little bit more control if you really press down, use the full brush. So you see there really pressing down onto the belly of the brush and then pushing the paint along that line. It's much easier to um, really press down than it is to try to have light pressure. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So that looks pretty good. I think that I will, while that's still a little bit damp, I'll come back in and do a little shine on the hat. So just a little bit of that phthalo blue. Here's a little bit of the titanium white that we had before. And I'll just run a line of color right there. And then on my towel, I can go ahead and get most of the paint out of my brush. I forgot to open my airbrush medium. So I can dip into the airbrush medium and then come back in with a mostly clean brush and just run it along that paint. If it gets too light, then we just add in a little bit more. The more times that you go back and forth, the more interesting that this little shine can look. If you have trouble with it, there's nothing at all wrong with letting it dry, letting this black part dry, and then coming back in for a shine on the hat. So it's just subtle, just a little hint there. We might do a little bit more later, but sometimes adding in some of those little details like that right now reminds me when I get closer to the end of the painting that I wanted a shine there. It's easy when you get to the end of the painting to forget what you had planned to do. My brush just had a little bit too much of the airbrush medium in it there. That's why you can see it being so transparent here. That's okay. I can just come back over it, paint over it again, And if I need to let it dry, I can do that too. If you want to move to a little bit of a smaller brush, if a smaller brush helps you feel like you have more control, certainly be willing to do that. It's easy as you're painting to struggle for a while and not take the time to just switch brushes. Try not to let yourself do that. And the opposite is also true. If things are working really well, don't change the brush because um, that's going to change a lot of things that how your hand is moving and all of that. So I do that so much. I get in a hurry and don't just take the time to switch brushes. And it's a kind of a silly mistake to make because you end up, struggling and not having fun with what you're doing. So there's our hat, very easily based in. We might have to come back in and do another coat, but as always, we're going to let this sit and make a decision about whether or not we want to come back in after it dries a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and clean my brush a little bit, just dip it in the airbrush medium, and blot it out on my towel until it's mostly clean. And let's go ahead and pull in some red. I'm going to put out a little bit of the Naphthol red light. I'm sorry, this is Pyrrole red. I have both. I have Naphthol red and Pyrrole in my heavy body. So Pyrrole red light, I've got out a little bit of the quinacridone magenta. And I think that what I'll do is start on the scarf. Since the black is still a little bit damp, rather than risking pulling any of that in, we can just move down to the scarf. I'm going to keep in mind again that the light source is coming from the top right. So I want my scarf to be brighter on this right edge. I think that I'm going to start with just straight Pyrrole red for the start of this scarf. And I might actually change to a different, I think I'm going to go ahead and change to a smaller brush, at least for a little while. Whenever you get out a new brush, just get it damp so it loosens those bristles up. You can get it damp in the airbrush medium. And I just want to take my time getting over that edge where that lasered line is for the art. And I'll let it be quite bright up here on this fold over of the scarf. I like to hold my piece to turn it. If you don't like to hold your piece, leaving it flat on your table is perfectly fine. And now I think that I'll start to add in a little bit of the quinacridone, just brush mixing a little bit between the two piles. I guess you can't really pull that over so it shows on the screen. You can see that it's very loosely mixed. I like to not over mix my paints when I'm color mixing on the palette. I'm going to pick up a little bit of the phthalo blue, and a lot of times I touch it on the palette like this just to get a little bit of it out. You can see how strong that color is. That just helps me get even a little bit of a darker color for this shadow area of the scarf. You could also add in a little bit of the burnt sienna if you wanted to darken that red. If you feel like it just, you know, it just got too purple. But I kind of like that, the way that that's looking. And now you can see I just dipped into the Pyrrole Red again, and I'm just going back between those two colors to pull it together a little bit. And as almost always, I didn't wash my brush out at all. I like having those colors, you know, kind of play together. And sometimes you have like a little bit of a happy accident. I have a puppy hair on my palette. When some colors come out of your brush unexpectedly, it's kind of like, oh, that looked kind of pretty. You can come back in with a little bit more of the straight red. And then go over again this area where there was a little bit more of the quinacridone and the blue. If we decide later that it's just a little bit too dark at the bottom, we can certainly lighten it up again, but I kind of am liking how that's looking. And again, here, the brush direction, the direction of your brush stroke matters. So following the shape of the scarf really helps to build that form. I'm gonna let it get a little bit darker up underneath of his chin here. You certainly don't have to do that much detail. It's fine as it is without that, but keeping in mind the shadows and building the shape really is kind of fun to do. So as the paint was running out of my brush there, I'm just kind of going back over those paint strokes just to pull the colors together a little bit. Mostly I'm looking for not a blend necessarily, but a soft transition between the colors. Add a little bit more of the blue. Some of your paint colors are more transparent than others. You can always tell by looking um, at your bottle to see. Trying to get my fingers here so you can see. Do you see this open box here on the quinacridone magenta? That means that that color is a very transparent color. On the Pyrrole Red, you can see that the box is half filled, so it's not quite as transparent as that quinacridone magenta. And the reason that I'm saying that here is you'll see it behave a little bit differently even as you paint it on to the surface of your piece. I have a little bit more of that dark on my brush than I want, so I'm just going to wipe it off and then come back with some pure Pyrrole Red and just go between those colors to pull it all together. gonna go ahead and let that dry. I am gonna come back and restate that brightest red later. Sorry, I keep hitting the microphone over here. Um, but I'm gonna let it dry first. I don't want to bother it too much at this stage. So let's start to do these folds of the scarf. We'll let this back one, oops, it slipped in my hand. We'll let this back one get a little bit darker. That happens to me so much as I'm painting, just the little fumbles that you do. The worst is like dropping the paintbrush. I get so relaxed with the paintbrush in my hand that I just drop it on my piece. Let's come back in. I just wiped the brush out on my towel, and I'm going to come in with the bright red for this top fold. And make sure that I do a nice edge over here. On some of my pieces, I like to paint around the edge. For this one, there's so many different shapes going on that I didn't want to complicate it by taking the scarf over the edge over here. Now I can bring a little bit of the pyrrole red into this darker area back here. And clean out the brush mostly, and then just run the mostly clean brush between those two colors. Created a little bit more of a actual line than I wanted, so I'm going to come back with the pyrrole red again, just go over that a little bit. Now we can add a little bit of shadow to this front. And I'm kind of just going to give it a little bit of motion, actually, just using a little bit of that darker color that we mixed, coming back in with the pyrrole red and bringing the colors together just a little bit. You can see you can be real loose with this at this point. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't need to be perfect. And we really don't, when our brush strokes are looser, the piece feels more comfortable to anybody who's viewing it. So I just added a little bit of detail. I'm going to come back and fix this edge a little bit so that I can make sure all the wood is nicely covered. And I want to do the same up here, just fix this edge. A little bit hard sometimes with the wood texture, just tap it in until it fills that in. It got a little bit dark, so I'll tap into the pyrrole red again. That's pretty good. Let's go ahead and do the hat. So again, keeping in mind our light source, I'll have this side of the band be a little bit brighter. And I'm not worried about painting over those berries because we're going to be making them reddish too anyway, so they will still show up. Those etch lines will still show up even if you paint over it. In fact, I'm going to purposefully paint over it um, just because at this point it's a little bit easier to fill in some of that engrave mark than to try to do it later. I'm going to dip into a little bit of the airbrush medium, tap a little bit of it out so I don't have too much, just to help my paint flow a little bit better across the surface. Getting my hand in the scarf a little bit. Let's go ahead and pick up a little bit of our darker. Again, remember the darker that I have here is the quinacridone magenta, a little bit of the phthalo blue. It's got a little bit of the pyrrole red because that's in my brush as well. Let it get a little bit darker at the bottom of this, the rim of the hat band, not the rim, the bottom edge of this like ribbon on the hat band. And now I'll dip into the pyrrole red and just start to bring those colors together a little bit. Letting it get a little bit brighter up here at the top since our light source is up at the top. So you can see how easily we can pull those colors together just by going back and forth between the pyrrole red and that darker red color that we've mixed. I just blotted out the brush. I'll come back into the pyrrole red again just to soften that transition between those two colors. If you feel like you need to soften it more, dip into the airbrush medium again, blot it out, clean your brush a little bit, get most of the airbrush medium out, and then just wipe between those colors. I just dipped into the pyrrole red again. I like some of those highlights that are happening. You see some of these highlights that are coming in. When you start to see some of that, don't overbrush the piece. Let some of those streaks stay and happen. I feel like I can see just a little bit of the wood here, so I'm just going to touch that up a little bit. It's one of those things, as an artist, I'm always watching. When something really interesting happens, always be ready to stop. Always be ready to not keep adding more paint. I was just looking for a smaller brush here. Here is a teeny tiny size 0 filbert. And like I mentioned in the part 1 of this class, um, these brushes that I'm using are very, very inexpensive for a full set of brushes. And I really like to use the very inexpensive brushes because I'm not very careful. I'm always scrubbing around with my brushes, and it's nice to just it's nice to not have to be careful. So I'm just tapping into these circles just to lay the first color of the berries in. So I used that darkest color there, that quinacridone magenta and phthalo blue. And then I can just come in and dot some red highlights along the side. I can even make a little bit of a pinker color. Grab some titanium white and just mix it into the edge. Um, Always when I mix, I have these variations of color, and I love being able to go back to my palette and have those variations of colors to choose from. So I'm just going to tap along the edge of these. And that's really fine. They don't need anything more than that. If you want to come back in after it's dry and do more, you certainly can, but that's really, really good where it is there. I'm going to go ahead and rinse out my brush just a little bit because I want to go to some white, and we'll set in the main shape of his eyes. So I'm going to start with just pure white. Anytime you wipe out your brush, anytime you wash it in your water, make sure that you get the ferrule dried or it will drip on your piece. So for the eyes, I'm going to just tap in and fill this whole eye shape. So I don't have to do a brush stroke particularly. I can just tap it and fill in that whole circle part of his eye. I was trying to decide if I wanted to do anything else as far as like a black line over the top. I might do like kind of a gray line maybe. So it's not, stark black. If you have an acrylic pen, you can certainly use a pen. So I set in that gray line. I'm just going to go back and tap back in with the white just to push it back into shape. I think that while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and do the mouth as well. So I'm just going to thin down the paint a little bit more with the airbrush medium. That's going to help the paint flow a little bit. And I'm going to come in and set in this mouth. It's a very fine line, and we don't have to worry because we haven't finished the snowman yet, and we're going to be able to reshape this eye when we come back in with the highlights. So we don't have to have it perfect. Don't worry about it being perfect. Good. While I have this black, I might as well go ahead and tap into the cardinal's face here. This is a pretty tiny little area, so again, just tapping your brush can really give you enough of that, um, enough of the paint there in that little tiny area. And his eye is back there. Again, it's tiny. We're not going to do a lot with his eye. What we can do if you're worried about forgetting his eye, the same thing that I talked about with the highlight on the snowman hat. If we want to, we can come back and just do a little tiny dot just in his eye. So I'm just gonna just touch, and it'll probably be bigger than I want it to be. It actually didn't turn out too bad. Let's see if I can show you. The camera won't focus on it. I'll show it up close in a little bit. It really doesn't need a whole lot more than that. I think maybe the snowman's eyes are dry enough that I can come touch back in with the black in those. So same principle as the cardinal eye. We're just going to tap it in. Um, this brush has a little bit of a frayed edge, so I'm dealing with that a little bit. He looks good. It's fun how a piece comes to life a little bit when you get the eyes in. I'm going to tap just around the edge just to fix the pupil a little bit. You can go back and forth, adding in the light, adding in the black until you have it the way that you like it. Good. I'm going to leave that set for now. I'm going to let that dry, and then we'll come back in and add some little catch lights, and I'll tell you a little secret that I like to do with the eyes on my pieces a lot of times. Let's go ahead and mix up some orange. Of course, we're going to need orange for the carrot on his nose. I'm going to also do a little bit of orange for the cardinal. Um, just for some highlights. So let's go ahead and bring out a little bit of the Hansa Yellow Opaque. I just need a drop. And I'm just going to mix it in with the red a little bit. Just get a nice orange color. And I have a little bit of black in my brush still, which is giving me kind of a muddy color. So I'm just going to move over to the side and mix again. Still dealing with this tiny little hair in my brush. So again, the same idea with the light source. So we want his little nose here to be a little bit lighter on the top, and then get a little bit darker as it comes to the bottom. I can come down to this muddy color that I mixed by accident earlier, add a little bit of quinacridone magenta to darken it. You can also add a little bit of phthalo blue. Of course, phthalo blue and orange are complementary colors, so adding a little bit of phthalo will tone that color down. Maybe I will add just a touch of the phthalo. You can see how crazy strong the phthalo is. I'm just going to touch in just a little bit of shadow, and then go ahead and blot out the brush and come back in and touch into that. I say settle it in a lot. I hope that that makes sense. It just kind of, um, just touching it with the brush just brings it together a little bit. We can lighten it up a little bit more for the top if you want to, spend extra time on it. So again, just kind of touching it. Let's quickly do a little bit on the cardinal, and then I think that we will end part one. I'm going to start with a little bit of the orange, and you can see as it comes off, I hope you can see as it comes off on the piece that it's um, there's lots of colors. It's not fully mixed, so you can see some areas that are a little bit more red, some areas that are a little bit more orange. I'm going to need a little bit more of the Pyro Red. This is one of the nice things about the fluid acrylics. You can easily open the little tab, put out a little bit of the color. Keep getting out of the camera view a little bit. I should have done his little beak while I had the orange in my brush. I'm going to use a little bit more of the quinacridone magenta down at this bottom area, the shadow side of him. Dip back into the Pyro Red to bring those together. Back to the shadow for underneath of the wing. And I'll do a little bit of this. This is mostly quinacridone magenta on my brush here. Just a little bit of it on his tail. My paint is drying there a little bit. On your palette, wherever the paint is really thin, like it is here where I've been mixing, that's going to dry faster than other areas. And that's completely fine. Just remix a little bit and do a little bit of shadow in the wing here. Get most of that out of my brush and go back to the Pyro Red and just brush over that area again. Since it's still wet, it will mix right as I'm painting. I have a little bit of that dark in my brush, so I'm going to bring a little bit of that up into the crust here, just so I can stroke back through it and give a little hint of the feathering. Like I said, he's really tiny there. Back to the Pyro Red. I kind of want a little bit more um, dark up here just to be able to stroke through it with the red. Give a little bit of the hint of the that crust there. So just work back and forth between the colors. Let's see. I think I'm going to thin out this red just a little bit so I can come back in and do just a little bit up here by his crest. And then a little bit more orange. And then I'll settle that back in again with a little bit of the Pyro Red. So I hope that you can see as you go back and forth between those colors, how really pretty you can paint him in. Let's quickly go ahead and give him a little hint of a beak here. You can certainly do more with a shadow. You really don't have to. It's just so tiny right there. Um, just trying to make a little bit of a darker color with that orange and quinacridone magenta and a tiny bit of phthalo blue. So I just kind of touched it in, and then I'll go back and touch it again with the orange. Yeah, he's cute. Let's end part 2 here. I think that we have a great start on him. Really, at this point, the hard part is over. We'll come back in and, of course, finish the highlights on his body and um, do the little pine on his hat, and then just a little hint of the cardinal legs, and this piece will be done. So I look forward to seeing you in part 3. Part 3 is linked below, so click that link and I'll meet you there. Welcome back to the studio. In this video, we are going to just do a few more of the details on our snowman, a little bit more work with the eyes of both the cardinal and the snowman, and the little pine detail that is going to be really fun to paint. So grab something warm to drink. I have some Monster Mash hot tea from Adagio Teas, and let's have fun and paint. So I think for these details, we'll start off doing the cardinal's feet here. Let's open up our palette. I've had this overnight stored in the Ziploc. If you open yours up and everything is dried, the great thing about using these little styrofoam plates is that you can just throw it away and start over. And that's also a great reason to just not put out too much paint in your piles. So with the cardinal's feet, I love to study whatever I'm painting. And from many years of painting cardinals, I know that their feet are kind of a purpley gray pink color. It's really an interesting color. For our piece here, we don't have to be really particular. His feet are so small, but any of those little studies that you can do to learn about what you're painting are kind of fun, and it stays in your artist memory bank for the next time that you paint. So to mix this, I'm going to start with a little touch of quinacridone magenta. I'm going to add in just the tiniest touch of the phthalo, and it is so strong. So I'm just going to keep touching my brush to the side over here to get some of that off. And then I think I'll touch into this burnt sienna that's left. That will gray it a little bit more. Let's grab a tiny bit of the titanium white to see where we are. A little bit more burnt sienna. We're just looking for sort of a brown red. And then I want to make sure I don't have too much paint on this tiny brush and just touch in simply these tiny little legs. Because the art base has the shape on them, we don't have to do a lot here. Those lines that were left by the laser are going to do a lot of the work. If you wanted to, you could add a little highlight, but again, this is just, it's so, so tiny that it really doesn't need a lot of detail here. So I just added a little bit more titanium white. I'll wipe out my brush and touch back into that to take a little bit out. Very easy. So let's go ahead and mix a green. I'm going to use a little bit of a larger brush just for the mixing. Um, go ahead and get my brush wet. And let's go ahead and do the phthalo blue. Move some of that over here and bring in some of the Hansa yellow opaque. I'm just stepping off to the side. That helps me to manage how much of that blue gets in there. You can see that it just takes just the tiniest little bit. Since I have this green mixed, I know I'm going to want a few different variations of this color. So I'm going to grab just a little bit of quinacridone magenta to make a little bit of a darker green. And then I think I'll add a little bit of titanium white over on this side to make a lighter green. You could see there that there was a little bit of red in my brush still. It's perfectly okay. All of those different colors are wonderful. And it's another reason why using the professional grade paints is great, because a little bit of color left in your brush won't completely ruin the mix usually. So I'll dip down into the airbrush medium, clean out my brush a little bit. You can see there it has quite a bit of that pink red still left in it. You could completely rinse out your brush in your water dish if you need to. And I'm going to thin out the more true green that we first mixed and start to do some of these details on his little pine hat. So I'm just going to touch sort of at the base and just flick out. So it's kind of a touch down and lift motion. Grab a little bit more paint. Remember, this is a little bit thinned out. Anytime we're doing thin lines like this, we want to thin our paint a little bit. The important thing to remember about thinning your paint is that it will make your paint a little bit more transparent, which is wonderful for details like this because that lets us come back in and add some different colors. So that's the main green. Let's go ahead and pick up some of that darker green. I might make it just a little bit darker, just a little bit more quinacridone magenta. And same thing, we're just going to touch down and lift and put just some different variations of green out here. I don't know if it's the weather. I don't think it's a full moon, but Lucy, our new kitty, has been a menace today. So I think that the last thing I'll do, just very, very simply, is come in and do just a little lighter variation. I want it to be a little bit more blue. I think the blue green in pine can look really interesting. So I just took that same mixture, added a tiny bit more of the phthalo blue, a little bit more of the titanium white, and then I'll grab a little bit of the airbrush medium to thin it some and come back in and just add a little bit of that. If you're working on yours and you feel like this lighter version took over some of the other greens, do another layer. Go back to your green and come back and just put a few spots of that in. Yeah, I think that that looks pretty good. I think that the only thing I want to add is to come back in and reinforce this base a little bit. Just darken where it first starts out of his hat here. Just kind of filling it in a little bit more um, at the base there to darken it. Yeah, he's cute. Let's go ahead and work on the eyes. I mentioned yesterday that I have something that I always love to do in eyes, and that is I always love to add a little bit of blue. I think that blue kind of can bring the eyes to life a little bit, sort of a reflection of the sky. So I've mixed just a little bit of titanium white, a tiny bit of the phthalo blue, and I'm just going to touch along the back right here. It's a little bit bigger than I want it to be. That's completely fine. In fact, I like it to be a little bit bigger to start out because then I can come back in with a little bit of the black on my brush and just touch right back into that to settle that in. So I really can only see just a tiny little hint of that blue there. Now I'll touch into some titanium white. I'm almost out here. And on the opposite side, more to the right edge, I'll do a little catch light, just a little touch. And that's it. His eyes are done, and that just those couple little touches really brought his eyes to life. Let's see if we can do a little bit with the Cardinal. Again, this is very tiny. You could get like a toothpick, or if you have like a stylus tool, um, you could use that for this tiny part. If you have small round brushes, those are great too. But for this series, I'm going to be keeping everything very simple. So I'm just going to use the smallest brush that I have here. I'm going to dip into a little bit of the airbrush medium and try to, this poor little brush has been used quite a bit and it's a little bit frayed at the end. So I'm going to try to make it behave a little bit. I'm just going to touch in with the white, wipe my brush out a little bit. For this eye, because it is so tiny, I'm not going to add any of the blue. I'm just going to go ahead and dip in, get a little bit of the black on my brush, and I'm going to tap this bottom corner. A little bit more black, tap it again. And I'll show you at the end of this class, I'll zoom in. I have the camera set so that it doesn't autofocus. So I think that the last thing that I want to do for this part of our video, I'm just looking to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Um, I think the last thing I want to do is something that's completely optional, but I'm going to add some evergreens to the bottom edge just to fill in this space. And I want these evergreens to be very um, transparent, very atmospheric. In art, when we say something is atmospheric, we mean that it contains more of the sky color. So remember, our sky color was the phthalo blue, burnt sienna, titanium white. We're almost out of burnt sienna. I might add just a tiny touch more over here. I feel a sneeze coming. Um, and if you're doing something like this, please understand this your piece is beautiful without this, but some of these little details can be fun to do, and um, try it. I think you'll be surprised at how well you can paint something that's not engraved on your piece with just a few little tips. So the first tip that I'm going to give you, if I can find mine, is to pull out a sketchbook. This is a well-loved sketchbook. If you don't have a sketchbook, just pull out any paper and do a little practice. Um, my sketchbook is full of lots of little loose drawings. I'm going to do a painting, a watercolor painting on that page. Here's some bluebird sketches that I did. But if you can just practice just a little bit on some blank paper, you'll feel a little bit more at ease, a little bit more confident when you go to your piece. So I'm just getting this brush wet. This brush that I have in my hand is a size 4. And I'm going to come down to this green that we just mixed. This green, it's got a little bit of extra blue. Just anything in there. I think I'll just touch into a little bit of red. I just want, even that was too much red. I just want to mute it down a little bit. Touching your brush on the side of your palette can really, really help. I want this to be quite light, so I'm going to mix in some titanium white. So there, I hope you can see we have just a nice little light green color. I'm going to thin it out so it stays very transparent. The nice thing about starting almost too transparent is that we can come back in once we have the main base added and add more details. So when I'm doing a evergreen tree, I think about at the top starting very vertical. So just kind of tapping in a basic shape. Then I'm going to start to twist my brush right and left as I work one side of the tree and the other. So just twisting, doing kind of both sides at the same time. As you come down the tree, we want to start letting these be more horizontal. So up at the top, they were more a V shape angled up. In the middle of the tree, they're a little bit more horizontal. And in the middle of the tree, I can press down a bit more on the brush, use more of the brush. Toward the bottom of the tree, now I'm going to use lots of pressure and let these branches angle down. So you can see that really, really easy. You can build a shape of an evergreen without too much work. Once you get it on your piece, if you like it, you can always come back in and add a few more of the darker green details if you want to. On this piece, I do want to keep it fairly soft. I'm going to try not to close my sketchbook so that it doesn't get the other page with wet paint. So let's see what I want to do here. I think that I'm going to do a little tree here. I've kind of sketched this out in Procreate so I could get a feel for what it would be like. I'm going to really thin down the paint even more than I had it in the sketchbook because I want it to be very transparent. And this way I can really sneak up on it without you know, being too locked in. So I think that my first tree will be about right here. I don't want it to be even with his nose. So I'm going to start about right here, I think. And I'm just going to lightly tap in just a basic shape so that I kind of know where I'm going, a little bit of a road map. And then I think I'm going to do a little tree right here. Again, Ving up at the top so that these top branches are angled up. And then using more of the brush as I get down to the bottom, really pressing in that shape. And I know that's very, very light, but if you start very light like that, you'll have much more control over where these trees are going. I think I'm going to do just one more, maybe a taller one over here. Again, I don't want it to be the same height um, as his crest there. I don't want things to line up like that. So let's make this one pretty big out here. Turning my brush, angling up at the top, trying to just let it be loose. I don't want to manage this too much. I want it to be loose and free, very much like an evergreen tree will. So underneath down here, I'll just start to kind of tap in. You might want to grab a little bit of a bigger brush. Let's see what I have here. I'll grab the 6 for these bigger, this bigger area down here. So once you lay that paint in, you can dip back into your airbrush medium, get most of the paint out of your brush, and then come back in and just tap to soften all of that in. I'm going to come back and fill in a little bit of this area that didn't get painted by the Cardinal. Yeah, I really like how that looks. The thing with the round that we really have to be careful of is that the tree doesn't bend with the round. So I'm going to come back and just straighten it a little bit. Yeah, I think that looks better. And those are the kinds of changes that we can make because we've started out so light. We've started out with our paint so thinned down. This tree, we can let it overlap. I'm just going to pick up a little bit of a variation of colors, maybe even, well, I'll start with this darker green first. Anytime that you mix a new paint or you pick up a new paint, take your first few strokes at um, just assessing if you like it. If it's too dark, then make some changes. I think I'm going to change this tree in the middle to be just a little bit more of have a little bit more of a blue cast. That will also help it sort of go back into the background just a little bit. So just picking up a little bit of that phthalo blue that was right here by the greens, adding some titanium white, and then thinning it so it's very transparent again. And I'm going to blot out my brush and come back into this tree and just add in a little bit of that blue, that more blue tint to it. Let's see. This is still pretty wet with the airbrush medium, so I want to let that dry a little bit. I think I'll come back in and just add a little bit of dark, to this big one on the side over here. You can see how that filbert brush makes a really interesting little upside down U shape. So just tapping away until I get it where I like it. The more you tap in the areas where you just put paint, the more that you can blend that out just a little bit. I want to darken it a little bit under this cardinal right here. And then darken it a little bit along this edge down here. And I do really want to darken this, but I want to let this part dry a little bit. So it's really, really cute. The last thing that I'll do to mine, and you can spend your time um, going back and forth on yours. You may have to let it dry just a little bit. I want to come back in with a little bit more of a, some of that blue coming in. That'll just help soften it a little bit. I have a little bit too much paint in my brush. So not really snow, but sort of just a highlight on the tree. Just have fun with it. It really is so fun. It really makes a big statement on the piece, kind of changes it. The thing to do here at this point would be take it to your kitchen, put it up on the counter, spend a little bit of time looking at it. Um, I've talked about this a lot on my YouTube channel, just how much of a difference it can make to spend a little bit of time with your piece. Um, I usually fall in love with my piece, not in my studio, but actually when I take it up and spend some time with it. So sometimes when I'm spending a little bit of time with it, I can see things that I didn't see in the studio. I can see things that I want to make changes to. A little bit blown out with the lights there. But he really is super, super fun and really, really cute. I'm going to end this video here. I will see you in the final part for our snowman piece as we come back in and set in some of the highlights on the snowman himself and get him all perfect. So the link to part 4 is in this video description. Just click that link and I will meet you there. Welcome back to the studio. In this final video for our snowman piece, we are going to do the finishing details. And this is really my favorite part. At this part, I know that the hard part is done. Now I can just come in and finalize a couple of the last little details, really making sure that everything that I wanted to capture is on my piece. So let's have some fun and finish our snowman. Here is our snowman. He is all ready for some final details. I'm going to go ahead and mix up a little bit more of this gray that we used on him because I'm going to want to be able to bring some of that in as I add some whites. So I'm going to start out with a 10-inch brush. I think that, sorry, not a 10-inch brush. I'm going to start out with a 10-inch size filbert brush. And I'm going to just come back in and mix some of this gray that we had before. And I can just come right back over the top of this dried area. Add in a little bit of the titanium white. And I hope that you can see on my palette how I'm leaving that not over mixed. So it's kind of darker to the side, and as I add more titanium white, it gets a little bit lighter, but there's lots of variations. I know that I'll say that a lot, but it is nice to not over mix your paints. Leave some of that happening. So I'm going to come in, have a little bit of that dark in my brush, which is fine. I'll actually wipe that out and set it back in. With these, with the liquid acrylics that we're using here from Golden, they're, you can't really build up the texture that you can with, like if you were using the heavy body paints. So it's going to take you just a couple of times of coming back with the lights again to get this as bright as we want the snowman to be. So I laid in a little bit of that titanium white, and now I'm just taking the brush and just running it along the edge of that white. I don't mind the brush strokes there. I like how some of those look, so don't overwork it. But you can see how you can begin to, even though this gray is completely dry, you can begin to make some of that brighter white come in. I'm going to make this gray just a tad bit more blue. So I just barely tapped into a little bit of that the phthalo blue there. It still looks a little bit grayer than I want. I'm going to tap into just the tiniest bit more. That's better. It always is, anytime that you mix paints, when you take the first few strokes of it with your brush, assess the color, see if it's right. If it's not, adjust it a tiny bit. So now I'm going to pick up a bit more of the titanium white and bring a little bit more of this highlight down on his arm. I'm going to blot out my brush and then just run the basically clean brush along the edges there. I don't want it to get too light up here by his scarf, so I'll tap back down into that shadow color that we mixed and touch that in. So I'm just going to keep working on these highlights. The one thing that I do want to bring up is I feel like I need a little bit of a round over here for the other part of his body. This isn't etched in, and it's not necessary to do, but with just picking up a little bit of that shadow color that we just made and running it from maybe right around where this edge of the scarf is, just letting it circle down kind of brings his shape together very, very easily. And then I can come in with some white. This is the shadow side of him, so I don't want to let it get too light over here. And again, this part of his body down here will be a little bit more shadowed because it's sort of under his arm. So once I set in the white, I can just pick up a little bit of that shadow color again, and then blot out my brush, use a little airbrush medium and come back in and run the brush between those colors. I lost a little bit more of that shadow than I wanted, so I'll just set it back in. So I'm going to keep working on building the highlights on the snowman. I'm going to fast forward from here so that you can see how it all comes together. Okay, I'm gonna call our piece done. I hope that you could see a few of the little details that I went in to add. I added a little bit more pink in the berries just to let them come to life just a little bit. I'm gonna touch some red back in them. You could even, if you wanted to, give them a little dot of shine. Just a little touch. They're so tiny. If you get too much shine, of course, just go back to the pink. The pink that I mixed up here is mostly the Pyrrole Red, a tiny bit of quinacridone magenta, and titanium white. Um, yeah, he looks really cute. I did come back in and just add a few more pops of that bright red Pyrrole red that you saw me add in that fast forward. I just let it be a little bit sketchy along this ribbon up here and just tapped in some spots on the scarf too to brighten some areas. With acrylic paints, the layering of paint coming back in and adding some of those layers is the magic. That's the trick. I added a little bit of pink to the Cardinal, just a little bit of highlight. And you could just like, you could keep playing with it for forever. Um, what else did I want to say before we finish? A couple of extra things. If you get, as Lucy comes in to visit, if you get to the end of adding the highlights into your snowman and you feel like it's a little bit too, thank you, Lucy. Yes, you're welcome to, yes, please sit right there. That's perfect. As you get to the end, if you feel like the snowman just isn't as smooth as you would like it to be, do a little bit of titanium wash glaze. So a glaze is just, again, that thinned out paint using the airbrush medium there. You could certainly use just water if you want. So just really control the amount of paint that's in your brush and come back in and go over some of the areas. Because it's so thinned out, it will really be transparent. It will leave some of your shadows really showing. Use a lot of your brush in most of these places where you really press down on the brush to pull that glaze across. And with this titanium white, you may want to let this dry at this point and come back in and add another bit of that brightest white on the top. You won't really be able to see how much, if any of that you need until it dries a little bit. And like I mentioned, until you spend a little bit of time with it where you're standing back from it and looking at it from a little bit of a distance. This darker line that I added here, that line really stands out to me. I don't really like it. So what I'm going to do is that very same glaze that we just talked about, I'm just going to go right over the whole thing. Then I'm going to blot out the brush and run the brush along that edge again. So at this point, take a picture of it with your phone and look at it in the picture. I don't know what it is about seeing it in a picture. It does just make everything a little bit more clear. It's a little mind trick that the picture plays on you. But I love taking pictures of my pieces to just see if there's anything that I'm missing or anything else that I want to add in. You saw me a little bit there with the thinned out black, go back in and add just a little more detail to the tops of his eyes. I cleaned up at the mouth a little bit. Just be careful when you're thinning out your paint that you don't let it get thin enough that it puddles. So you want it to be inky consistency, but not too watery. If it kind of puddles up on your surface of your substrate, then you'll know it's got just a little bit too much water. So the last thing that I would do to this piece is sign it. And I have a little artist mark that I use. I don't like my signatures to be very um, large. I don't like them to distract. So I'm going to use a black Posca pen. This is an acrylic pen. I love these. And I'm just going to make my little artist signature down here. Not really a signature so much as an artist mark. If it shows up too much, if you don't like how dark it is, again, we can let it dry and come back in and glaze over it with a little bit of that sky color to set it in. But I'll spend a little bit of time with it and decide, make a decision on what I think that it needs. So that's it. That's our very first everyday art playlist complete. I have a beautiful piece. I'm going to be displaying this in my kitchen on a little display easel. I think that people just really love to decorate with these small pieces, and they're wonderful gifts, of course, amazing to sell. So I hope that you'll try it. I hope that you will post a picture. Try not to let the lights blow it out too much. I hope you'll post a picture of yours so that I can see your completed snowman. It's such a fun piece to do. And be sure that you are subscribed to the YouTube channel so that you get a notification when a new class is loaded and ready for you to paint.